it's Barbara from Caring Arts, and I love the autumn. I love everything about it, from the cool crisp air to the changing leaves to pumpkin pie and squash soup, Halloween and Thanksgiving. I really love it. So today I want to pay tribute to a simple item that's representative of autumn. It is a pumpkin. We're going to do a very easy still life today of a pumpkin using the simplest of materials, perhaps something you haven't used since you were a child, crayons. But it's one of my favorite things. The nice thing about crayons is you can take them with you. You can pop them in your purse and take them to the doctor's office if you have to hang out there for a while. Just bring a pad of paper and you can do really amazing things with crayons. They're not just for children. So we're going to get started. I want to show you, this is the project we're going to create, and this is done in crayons. So I'll show you everything you need to know, and we're just going to get started. There's very few things you need. This is a very simple project. We'll need some crayons. You don't need that many. I'm not using any special colors here. A set of 24 Crayola crayons would be plenty. And you need some paper. I have some light tan paper. You can use any color, or it could be white, but a lighter color is the best. And if it has a little grain, that's fine, or a little texture, but that's not necessary either. And then I have some leaves that I grabbed from my oak tree outside. They're small, and I'll show you how we're going to make use of those, but I'm using those as some reference as well as my little pumpkins here. And one thing to keep in mind whenever you're doing a still life is to consider the light source. And you can see on my pumpkin here, the light is coming from this side and a shadow is being cast on the opposite side. So that's something you want to keep in mind, is where your light and shadow are, and that's something we're going to make use of. Pumpkins have different types of stems. And I'm going to draw one with a little button because it's easier, and many of them have that. So I'm going to start about 3 inches down from the top of the paper, and I'm using my paper horizontally, but you can use it vertically as well. It doesn't matter. But I'm going to put just a little oval using my brown crayon. You can use any color really for this part. That's going to get me started. So you can see I have my little oval, and then I'm going to put another one. I'm going to call this my button. I'm going to put another one on the inside, just like that. We're going to sketch out our whole pumpkin before we fill it in. So you can make any kind of stem you like. It can be straight, it could be curved. But you start from that edge of the inside oval, and I'm just going to go up and create some kind of a stem. I think I'm going to make a curved stem. I've made different kinds, and I'll put a little top on it. And then the stems have ridges. Pumpkin stems always have ridges, so I'm going to add a couple of lines that look like ridge lines. You can see, we can see through everything, kind of like a ghost. That doesn't matter, because we're going to fill this in. Also, do not be worried about coloring outside of the lines, because that adds character, and I do that all the time. Now we're going to add an oval starting from the very center of that little button, and kind of a large oval coming down. And that's going to be the first segment of our pumpkin. I think I'm going to change to orange to do the rest of these. So, and you can see I'm not being perfect, and you don't need to be. So I'm just kind of sketching that out, and that's my first pumpkin segment. And then to make some more, you start at the bottom of the button here and just create another segment going out and connecting near the bottom of the first one, like that. You can make these any size you want. I'm going to make another one on the other side. And they connect near the bottom of the first one. And then I'm just going to keep going, so I go all the way around. Now as I move around the pumpkin, they connect a little bit higher than the last one. So on this side as well. And your pumpkin can be any shape. I like fat pumpkins. I think they're cute. So, and then we have a couple of segments on the back that you can't really see. So just to give a hint of those, I'm going to create kind of a little triangle right there on the back. And I'm going to do the same on the back over here. And that's going to be the segments of our pumpkin that go behind. There we are. That's our basic pumpkin. It already looks like one. And we're going to start coloring it in. I'm going to start with my yellow, probably the lightest color I'm going to use besides white. Because with crayons, it's a layering process, and you always want to layer dark colors on top of light colors. So I'm going to start with yellow, which is going to be the highlight color for my pumpkin. And keeping in mind my light source, my light is going to be coming from this way, because it is actually coming through my window right now. So I'm going to put some yellow where I think the light would be hitting on the top of my pumpkin. So, and mostly on this side. So I'm going to put some back here. It's kind of going to fall in the middle of each segment. And I'm not pressing too hard. It's probably best to not press too hard as you go, because you can always make it darker, but it's hard to make crayons lighter because they're very difficult to erase. So you want to keep it kind of light, and you can go over it a couple times if you need to. And then on the front segment of my pumpkin, it's going to be, my light is a little more on this side because it's coming from over here. Keeping in mind where your light is coming from. And I'm going to have a little bit over here, but it's going to get less and less as I go around this side of the pumpkin because the stem is in the way, so the light wouldn't be hitting it quite as much. So I'm just going to add a little bit here. I can always add more later if I want. So those are my highlights. And next, I'm going to take my orange. I have a couple of different oranges here, but I think I'm going to take just regular orange, that's what this is, and start filling in the color of my pumpkin. And then I'm going to come back to the stem. So I'm just going to start kind of on the edges of each segment and come in, meeting my yellow. In fact, you can go a little over the yellow. That's just fine. And again, I'm not pressing too hard, and just getting a nice even layer of color down. And coloring a little bit into my yellow. And again, you can always make this darker, so I'll probably come back later and make it a little bit darker. But as we go around, we're going to do the same thing for each segment. You can press a little harder on these segments of the pumpkin because these are going to be starting to get in shadow, so we want them to be a little bit darker. But there are other ways to add shadow and make them darker, so don't worry about that too much. We're just going to make our pumpkin orange. And I'm going to go all the way around and do that to all my segments. So you can see I've colored my pumpkin in, and it's nice and orange, and it's a little bit darker on this side of the pumpkin where my shadow is going to be. I pressed a little bit harder, and also on the bottom, but we're going to make adjustments to this as we go. You can still see my yellow highlights, but I've colored into it a little bit, and that's fine. I've gone out of the lines a couple places, and that's absolutely fine too. So we're going to add more color to this, but before we do that, I want to work on my stem a little bit. So I think I'm going to start with a light green, and I'm going to color in around the edges mostly of my stem and my little button. Now we're going to add some brown because pumpkin stems usually are pretty brown, but I just want to add a little bit of green. And I'm going to color over where that line goes behind because we don't really need to see that. So put in some green. I might add a little yellow, but then mostly this is going to be brown. And I'm kind of staying in the center of each of my segments. So just added a little bit of green. And now I'm going to take my brown crayon, and I want it to look like this little button is going around behind the stem. So on the edge where the stem comes, I'm going to make that kind of a darker brown, so it looks like it's going around it. And then the same on the other side. And I'm going to make my little button lines a little bit darker so you can see them better. And then right around the edge of that button, I'm going to add more brown. But I'm keeping a little highlight in the center of it. So not too much. And again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And now I want to make the rest of the stem a little darker. So I'm going to make my lines a little bit darker. And then where my ridges are, I'm going to start coloring from the ridge out to the rest of the stem, because I want it to look like the ridges are going in. So I want that to look a little bit darker. So right around those ridge lines, I'm adding some more brown, and also on the bottom, because I want it to look like the stem is going inside the pumpkin. We're probably going to add a little more black to this too. I don't like to use a lot of black because it starts to get muddy, but we're going to add just a few little touches of it. And do the same thing on this side of the stem. You can see I'm making this side of the stem a little bit darker because that's in the shadow. The light is coming from this way. So it's going to be a little more brown on this side. So it looks a little bit darker. And again at the bottom, so it looks like my stem is going inside the pumpkin, which it does. And now you can hardly even see those lines that were going behind there that I drew originally. Those have just disappeared. So there we are, and I'm going to add just a little bit of black to make those ridges stand out a little bit more. I use black very sparingly, but I'm going to add a little bit where it's going behind, where the button's going behind the stem, like that, on either side. And also on this edge especially. And down where it's going into the pumpkin, because I want some good shadow in there. So now it really looks like the stem is going inside that button. That's looking pretty good. I think I'm going to add just a little more brown to the little button itself, just to make it a little more brown color. Which is the color a stem of a pumpkin would be. But we're not trying to be super realistic here, so you know, I'm going to add some colors you wouldn't normally find in a pumpkin just because I want it to be interesting. I think our stem is pretty good. So now we're going to go on and add more shadow in the rest of the pumpkin. So as I said, using crayons is a layering process. So this is a red orange, and I'm just going to keep layering additional color into it. So I want my pumpkin to start to look more three-dimensional. So around many of the same places I've already put orange, I'm going to add a darker orange. And I'm going to start where the ridges of the pumpkin are and come into each segment. Kind of layering right over the first orange, which was just a regular orange. But I'm not coming in quite as far because I want the ridges to stand out more. And starting to create some deeper shadows. But again, you just layer the color in because you can always add more. It's hard to take away. So little by little, we're just going to keep adding more color. And you can always go back and adjust later. I'm going to add, so whenever I want it a little bit darker, I'm going to add a little darker orange. So that's especially around the bottom and around the sides of each ridge. And we're just going to keep layering in more and more color. So you can see I've added a little bit darker orange, especially on this side and around the bottom. And blending it into the orange I already had. I'm going to add a little bit more to these segments in the back. And then we're going to start adding some additional colors. Maybe colors you wouldn't necessarily find in a pumpkin, although you might find them in a squash. But I think I'm going to start adding some red. And again, a layering process. So we're going to start from some of the same places we started at before and just layer in some stronger color and just keep doing that layering process, but each time with a darker color. So our shadows get deeper and our pumpkin starts taking on more and more of a three-dimensional look. I want to start making this more dramatic, so next I'm going to choose a red-violet, and really you can make this progression of colors to be whatever you like. I particularly like purple in shadows. You could also use blue, but since the pumpkin is nice and warm, I probably would prefer purple, so I think I'm going to end up adding some purple as well. But again, I'm just going to go over those same areas and it's going to just keep getting progressively darker. And I'm just going outside of the line sometimes, and that's okay. We want this pumpkin to have some character, so it does not need to look perfect. But again, I'm keeping my darker colors on the bottom and on this side of the pumpkin, because that's where the shadow is. So this side is going to be a little bit lighter, and this side I'm adding some deeper colors and a little bit more of them. You can see in general I'm keeping my strokes for the most part vertical, moving around the shape of the pumpkin. It's giving a sense of the pumpkin's ridges. But that's looking pretty good. I want to deepen up these shadows a little more. So I'm going to choose my purple. I've got two purples here. I think one is a little more violet. Choose whatever you like. But I'm going to really start deepening the shadows around the bottom and around this side of the pumpkin. So starting at the bottom, I'm going to start coming up with my purple. And this is really going to start to get more dramatic now. And I'm pressing a little bit harder around the edge, and then as I come up and in, I press a little bit less. So that way it blends the colors very nicely, and you can always go back over parts you want darker. So especially around these bottom areas, which is where the shadows would fall, I'm going to be a little bit darker in those areas. So this is looking pretty good. I have lost a little bit of the orange of my pumpkin just because I've added so many other colors. So this is a good time to go back and add your lighter colors again where you feel you need to. I'm just going to add a little more orange. And also when you color over darker colors with lighter colors, it does help to blend them in more as well. So just going to add a little bit more orange. And I think I'm going to then add a little bit more yellow just to make those colors a little bit stronger. But again, this is a layering process. It's up to you how much you add of whichever colors. I'm going to make my yellow a little bit stronger here. Add a little bit of yellow in here too, to make my stem look a little bit warmer. It's a very subtle process, but it does make a difference. And then the last thing I like to do, and we're not done yet because we need to add a shadow. Right now our pumpkin's floating. We need to add a shadow under it so it looks like it's sitting on something. But I want to add a few really strong pops of highlights. It just adds something to this. So I'm going to take my white and just on top of those yellow areas where I want the highlight to be the strongest, I'm just going to add a little bit of white. It's kind of subtle, but it really does make a difference. And also on my stem, on this side where the light would be hitting it. So that looks pretty cool. And now we need to add some shadow underneath the pumpkin in order for it to look like it's sitting on something. So I really like purple for shadows. So I'm going to take my dark purple and starting from the bottom edge of the pumpkin, and I'm going to kind of go in this direction because the light is coming from here, so the shadow would be cast this way. I'm just going to add some purple, and it's a little bit darker where it touches the pumpkin, and then as I go out it gets a little bit lighter. I press a little bit less. So I'm just going to keep doing that until I have a shadow that's about the size I want it to be. You can see it's a darker purple, closer to the pumpkin, and then the whole shadow moves off to this side, and it gets lighter as it moves away from the pumpkin. But I think having it be just purple is a little boring. Often an object will cast a little bit of its own color onto the surface below it. So I'm going to add a little more warmth to this. I think I'm going to add a little bit of this red violet. Just to give a sense of some warmth underneath it, and maybe some orange as well. It makes the color of the shadow look a little more interesting, and it also gives a sense that the pumpkin, the glow of the pumpkin is casting itself onto the surface below, which it probably would. Mine isn't doing that because it's on a black surface, but if you were sitting on a light colored surface, it would do that. And it's always good to have an actual reference in front of you so you can see how things really look. And then I'm going to add just a little hint of black. Again, I don't like to use a lot of black, but right around the very bottom part of the pumpkin, I'm going to add a little bit of black just to make the shadow a little bit deeper there. I'm not using very much because I don't want it to look muddy, and it will start to do that. You want to use black sparingly. And then the last thing we want to do is add a leaf and a little bit of a vine. You can see some vine left on it. And I always think that makes a pumpkin look more interesting. So I'm going to take one of my oak leaves here. You can use as many leaves as you want. You don't have to actually trace them, but that's what I'm going to do. It's just a little easier and quicker. And if you put them on the ground around the pumpkin, which you can do, you want to make sure you do that before you add the shadow. But I'm going to put mine at the top. And I think I'm going to just trace that. I think I'll use my green, even though I'm probably going to change the colors of these leaves. But with my dark green, I'm just going to trace very quickly around this little leaf. It's an easy way to make the leaves. And there we have a leaf. Now I actually want to change the color of this leaf, even though it's green here. I'm not going to make a green leaf. I want it to look like a fall leaf that's changed colors. And I'm also not worried about the outline of my leaf being perfect, as you can see. I'm going to add some veins to make it look a little bit more interesting. And then I'm going to add some color, and I'm just going to scribble in some fall colors. Some orange. I'm not worried at all about this being realistic. I just want to give a sense of the autumn and those beautiful autumn colors. So I'm just scribbling in some orange. I'm going to scribble in some yellow. Maybe a little bit of brown, especially around the edges. This is just to give a sense of autumn and that the leaves are changing. And you can see I'm not worried about staying inside the lines. It's boring to stay inside the lines. Maybe a little purple or a little violet. Well, I should add some red too. Need a little red. Oh yeah, definitely needed some red. So now that looks like an interesting fall leaf, and the very last thing I need to do now is to add my vine. So pumpkin vines just curl around. I'm going to come out of the stem here and just make a random curly line. That really adds some movement and interest. I'm going to do it over here as well. It's going to go right on top of my leaf. And there's our autumn pumpkin.